This is Climate Watch. I'm Zhao Ying. Welcome to the show. As the year comes to a close, it's a good moment to pause and take stock of where we are on climate change. The big picture hasn't changed. Global emissions are still high, ecosystems are under pressure, and extreme weather continues to reshape lives around the world. But at the same time, there have also been moments of real progress. This year, renewable energy overtook coal as the world's largest source of electricity, driven largely by rapid expansion in solar and wind. China saw its carbon emissions fall this year, raising the possibility that its emissions may be nearing a peak. And 10 years after the Paris Agreement, we are beginning to see signs that some of its promises are starting to translate into real-world change. So today, we are stepping back to look at the year as a whole. What climate events mattered most? Where did we see real momentum? What risks remain? And as we head into 2026, what should we be watching most closely? To help us make sense of all this, I'm joined by Fei Fei, who has spent the past year covering climate and environment stories. Fei Fei, thanks for joining us.
Hi, Zhao Ying. Glad to be back on Climate Watch.
Looking back over the past year, what climate event do you think we should pay the most attention to, and why does it matter?
Well, it's really difficult to pinpoint an exact event in climate change this year or over the past few years. But I think when it comes to, for example, health, how the health system and the public health and also our individual health has been affected by climate change is worth noting. Because I think not only this year, but also in previous years, Climate Watch talked with experts from Tsinghua University, and also they're working together with the Lansing Countdown Regional Center for Asia to look at how health sectors being affected and also responding to extreme weather events and other climate change related events in general. And for this year, well, they looked at really last year's cases, is that a lot of diseases that are not familiar to, well, most of us living in warmer climates or even in cold climates, that we are seeing diseases like the chikungunya and dengue fever. And maybe a lot of people are not aware of this, but the reason we are seeing more reports, more cases of these two fevers, the chikungunya and dengue, is precisely because of climate change. Because these fevers used to be only limited in tropical regions. For example, I think they were originated in Pacific Island regions and other warmer regions. But as the climate is getting warmer, it's warming up, and the transmitter of these diseases, the mosquitoes, different types of mosquitoes, their activity range becomes wider, and that means the transmission of the diseases themselves are spreading to more population, to more regions. So that's why we're seeing that, I think, up till quite in the central part of China this year are also reporting cases of the dengue and also a new name, chikungunya, this year. So I think it sort of became another alarming point for a lot of people, is that climate change is not just about meteorological changes. It's not only just about a few more extreme weather events and harsher swings in temperatures. It's invisibly and more visibly now affecting a lot of sectors that is not within our expectations before, such as health. So I think in response to these new changes, a lot of policymakers, city planners in particular, are setting up plans to respond to these alarming incidents of more diseases and unfamiliar diseases before. So I think this year I spoke with Cai Wenjia, who is the director of the Lansing Countdown Regional Center for Asia, and she's also a professor at Tsinghua University. We explored explicitly on how Chinese cities are responding to this warming climate and how the health sector are preparing themselves for more events and more diseases.
Okay, so let's take a listen.
One of the most important infectious disease in China is the dengue fever. Well, in north part of China, we haven't heard of that a lot, but we know that in south part of China this year we have been really being harassed by this type of disease which causes you a really high fever. It's being transferred by the mosquitoes. You certainly would witness, or you have this feeling that after the rainfall, those mosquitoes becomes more active. 3 phases from egg to pupa. It needs to be developed in water. And that is why exactly these rainfall, the strength of the rainfall and also the length of the rainy season would really be a sensitive parameter to influence the amount of mosquitoes and also the active level of those mosquitoes. So I would say with more and more heavy rainfalls happening around us, with more amounts of mosquitoes and more active mosquitoes, then it would help spread dengue fever. And I can't help to mention that this summer we also learn a new word, which is the chikungunya fever, also happening in south part of China, and we haven't heard about it. So this kind of chikungunya fever was also carried by the mosquitoes. I have to say that if the frequency becomes higher in the future, and we might be able to see more and more infectious diseases, not only existing ones but also new ones being brought to our daily life. And actually, if you look at our annual report, you would see the climate suitability to transfer dengue fever in China has been increased in half of the cities, more than 200 cities in China. So from south part of China until the middle and even middle north part of China, their climate suitability are increasing. For most of the cities, especially in southeast part of China, the climate suitability to transfer the dengue fever is increasing. So that really deserves our further attention.
I noticed that you are trying to carry a more hopeful turn in this year's report, and you emphasize a lot about risks as well as different more extreme weather events. But I do also notice you are sort of highlighting a lot of opportunities that could be found in this link between climate and health. So can you also share with us what opportunities are there for people to find, for business to thrive?
Yeah, I really love this question because previously when I talked to some of the city level decision makers, they will see, well, health adaptation is something new, and I'm used to building those spongy cities. I'm used to promote those water-saving agriculture sector, but health adaptation is something they don't know what to do with. But with more and more evidence being provided to how the health of the citizens being affected by climate change, people are started to become more curious on this issue. And one thing I want to mention is that once you invested in those early warning systems building, we have seen these evidence in Tianjin and also in Shanghai, in China. They have successfully reduced the incidence of some climate-sensitive disease like stroke, which usually takes each household around 20,000 yuan to treat stroke. That is quite a lot of money for the ordinary people. So if we have these early warning systems being set up, it will be a very effective tool to reduce the incidence rate, and which will not be only good for the general public because they don't need to spend money into the hospitals. They can spend money to enjoy their holidays, to go outside and to do shopping. But it's also good for the government that could reduce their burden to pay for those health insurance. And this is something I want to say that's highly cost effective and could be paid back within 2 or 3 years of investment. The second thing I want to emphasize is that don't only treat health adaptation as a cost. Treat it as an industry opportunity, because we see the overall objective to become a climate adapted society by year 2035. Then how to do that? We need technologies. We need infrastructure building. Then who would be there to fill in this technology and infrastructure gap? There is a huge role for the industries to fill. So, for example, if we want to build climate resilient cities, then there will be a huge demand, if I may say, for those, let's say, like green roofs, cool roofs, and new urban designs. And these are the new business area.
That is Cai Wenjia, director of the Lancet Countdown Regional Center for Asia. Fei Fei, on the more hopeful side, what do you see as the most encouraging progress we've made in decarbonization?
I think one noticeable progress this year is definitely in the carbon market, not only falling under the Article 6 of the Paris Agreement internationally, but also here in China. And I think in China, for the first time, that the country's released a central government document that lays out a very clear roadmap for a national carbon market. And also that, the national carbon market has been piloting for a few years, but these documents laid out a very clear timeline for that. By the year 2027, for instance, the trading system is expected to cover essentially all of the country's major emitting industries. And for, I think, this year, they expanded to sectors like steel, cement, and aluminum, and a part on top of the power sector. So you can see that China is steadily pushing forward with the construction of its carbon market. And also the country also vowed that the voluntary carbon market, meaning the part of the market that will also cover other sectors of the economy, and also maybe the public someday in the future, will reach full coverage in key sectors by the year 2027. And the ultimate goal is that by 2030, it aims to have a fully functional national carbon market built on a cap and trade system with a mix of free and paid allowances. This can be understood also as a milestone in the process, is because, for years, China's been trialing and testing with this cap and trade system in the power sector and also in other big industrial sectors, and now it is going forward. It's confident enough, and I think one of the key reasons is that the infrastructure, the data are there so that they can push forward on a nationwide system. But it's a very technical area in terms of the carbon market. So I reached out to Dr. Qing Yan for this topic. She is based in Oslo, Norway, but she is the principal analyst at carbon consultancy Clear Blue Market. She's been deeply involved not only in the EU carbon market building, but also here in China as well.
This high-level policy sets out the roadmap for the medium and long-term development of the carbon market, as well as a very comprehensive list of tasks, but all for the purpose of strengthening carbon pricing. So this is very significant. And also for me as a carbon analyst working with the market for in over, say, 16 years in Europe and China. Yes, with this clear guidance and also with the recognition of the importance of carbon pricing, then this really set the tone of carbon pricing is one of the most important climate policy instruments for China to achieve the climate target. And all this list of tasks will be implemented in the coming, say, years. But all this shift, all this announcement on what you have said on sector expansion, on switch to absolute cap, and also to gradually introducing more paid allowance allocation, which is we calling auctioning in the European carbon market context. All of this do not come out of blue. These are years in the making. And some of them in a very brief form has been mentioned in previously ETS regulations or other more broader rules concerning, say, climate policy and carbon markets. But of course, this time when or the sector expansion, and especially the switch to absolute cap, has been so prominently set out as a mid-long-term objective. This, I believe, is after thorough consideration, both by the leadership and by the regulators, because the time is ready to announce this and pin this in the roadmap. And why is because that China, for a few years back, China announced the carbon peak and the carbon neutrality goal. And we have also seen the tremendous progress with the rapid renewables development and how China's emission intensity has been improving. And now, at the moment, China is switching from a energy dual control to carbon dual control in the 15th five-year plan, the next 5 years. So I would say the overall framework is ready as the leadership want to prepare China to a more carbon constrained economic growth model. So combining both carbon intensity, but eventually total carbon emissions control. So that's why I think this shift is happening and is only being officially announced and pinned to the roadmap at the moment.
So when it comes to, for example, when it comes to absolute emission caps, for some sector, not for, the whole of the societies, first of all, what kind of sectors will be targeted for these caps and what kind of challenges will them encounter in the transition into these absolute caps?
I think, first of all, this high-level recognition of switched absolute cap has been a dream for carbon market observers like me has been hoping for. Yeah, a few years back when China launched the carbon market, we sort of have to say, yes, it's an intensity-based scheme adapting to China's characteristics as energy consumption continued to grow, and the climate target was still a intensity-based. But as you know, I'm a fundamental economist, that carbon markets and cap and trade, it has to have a cap, and it has to have a absolute declining cap on a yearly basis in order to drive emissions down, such as in the European carbon market. So yes, it's very welcomed also in the international community with this announcement. And yet, in the high-level opinions, it says very clearly that by 2027, for the sectors that their emissions have stabilized, meaning probably their emissions have peaked and is going to plateau or probably going to decline, then the regulator will start with absolute cap in these sectors, which, according to my modeling, I think this will likely be the cement and steel sectors. Because I'm a very quantitative analyst. I analyze emissions and production data by sectors. I observe from the production data that China's cement and steel sector emissions have peaked already, I think, last year because of a mix of policies, and one important one is the one cutting over capacity. So I think that very likely the absolute cap will happen, or absolute amount of total allowance allocation will happen for the 2027 emissions of steel and cement sectors. And then it can be rolled out to other sectors, and which I think probably other industrial sectors, but I think power sector might be the last. In my modeling, I think China's total, say, CO2 emissions for the energy sector will peak before 2030, but power sector could be the last because of why? Because of electrification needs. So we electrify more the industry sectors, so industry sectors emission decline first, but power sectors, even though renewables are developing, but it will take 2 or 3 years more before China's power sector emissions can peak and then gradually decline. So I think that this is perhaps what the regulator have in mind as well. Then they decide on this phased approach of transition to absolute cap. Well, challenges, yes, I mean, China's carbon emissions is vast. At the moment, with power and 3 industry sectors, it's already more than 80 billion tons. So that's 7 times more than the EU ETS at the moment. And it's going to be even bigger by 2030, probably covering 80% of China's total CO2 emissions. I would say at least 10 billion tons or more. So in this vast system, just think of the scale. For me, the big challenge is data. With this scale, then how can you set a, say, absolute cap that is fair, scientifically sound, also be able to incentivize a proper emission reduction pathway is quite challenging and requires incredible process data on emissions from every say large emitters in power, in the industry, probably aviation. So yeah, I think this is the challenge.
That is carbon market analyst Qing Yan. Fei Fei, of all the climate stories you covered this year, which experience has stayed with you the most?
I think for this year, me and other members at the Climate Watch, we traveled to 2 different places here in China, looking at how ancient wisdom can actually help us in many of the climate responding measures, for example, in adaptation building. And we visited, for example, the city of Quanzhou, where we looked at how oysters are helping reinforce a century, well, almost 1,000-year-old bridge, a nation bridge. And that's really an eye-opening experience simply because it's not only just about a smart and fun ancient architecture to look at, but also the local people, some of the experts in the city of Quanzhou and in their areas in the Fujian province, they're also experimenting and trialing how to recycle and reuse oyster shells and also those glues on oysters that can be applied in other sectors. I think in Quanzhou, some of the areas are experimenting by burning oyster shells into ashes, and these ashes can help the healthy level of the soil that they're using for the agriculture sector, which is very interesting.
And then what climate issue or event do you think has been underreported but really deserves more public discussion?
Well, I think apart from, the building of a carbon market, which feels like, or building up a citywide or even national-wide adaptation plans, these topics feels more distant for a lot of our listeners because they are not city planners themselves, or they are not in the financial or in the market themselves. But when I spoke with Ian Chu, who is the founder of a startup called GreenyWeb, it's a Singapore-based startup working to clean up the digital world. He told me that digital waste is also taking a toll on our climate. What does digital waste mean? It can mean a lot of things. It can mean some files you've been saved on your computer, on the cloud system, for instance, for years and years and not even click open them once, or some emails you saved on your email boxes that you think, well, it might come in handy someday in the future, but hasn't really been that visible in your daily life. And those unopened and saved up emails, some of the files on your cloud, and also when it comes to corporates, there's a lot of projects that been shelved digitally or have been saved also in their archives digitally are also taking up a lot of spaces in the physical world. It's not just about saving them up on the cloud system. So Ian actually told me how they've been working to clean up this digital world and to help reduce the carbon footprint of corporates in the first step, but hopefully someday in the future on our individual pieces as well.
Okay, let's take a listen.
A lot of what we know about technology in relation to the environment has been positive, right? So there's a lot of talk about how things like artificial intelligence, the internet, tech itself can bring good to the environment. And I don't dispute that. But the flip side is also true, whereby the amount of energy we consume for data centers, the amount of water we put into data centers, all of this has also a negative environmental impact. And that's where the terminology digital carbon emissions come in, where it's the CO2 that we put into the atmosphere indirectly because of our use of digital products and services. For example, each time we send an email, anywhere between 3 to 5 grams of carbon dioxide is emitted into the atmosphere because of the energy used by data centers that is powered by non-renewable sources of power. So this brings us to the terminologies, right? Things like digital decarbonization and sustainable digital transformation. So these are two terms that I may use interchangeably during the course of our conversation, and they're actually two different sides of the same coin. So when we think of digital decarbonization, we're thinking along the lines of how can we reduce the data that is being consumed by existing technology to reduce the amount of energy being consumed by our CPUs and GPUs, and by extension, reduce the amount of carbon dioxide emitted through the burning of oil and gas to power our digital devices. So digital decarbonization looks at how we can decarbonize what we already have. How can we decarbonize our existing websites? How can we change the blockchain, for example, to a more eco-friendly version of what it is right now? On the other hand, sustainable digital transformation is how can we build greener for the future? How can we, for example, build a low carbon mobile application or green AI, right? So these are two things that are key, and these are very fundamental to the topic of technology and how it intersects with the green economy.
Well, that's a very interesting point that you brought up, especially when we're talking about, emails. We're thinking about we're not using paper, we're actually helping with the environment, but it still, generates some sort of carbon dioxide along the way. How do you think can tech companies reduce their carbon emissions? How to build a greener app or how to make the websites more sustainable?
I think it really boils down to three things. Number one would be education. Number two would be non-coding digital practices. And I'll elaborate a bit more on that later. And number three, it would be the computer code itself. So going on to the first thing, the most basic thing would be education. And if you look at the textbooks that computer science students are using in universities nowadays, they are the 15th, 16th, 18th edition of a textbook written more than 20, 30 years ago. In other words, the fundamental aspects of how we interact with technology, of computer code itself, hasn't really changed in the last 20, 30, 40 years. It has remained fundamentally the same, and the only changes might be examples used in the textbooks or how the textbooks have changed from non-color to colored versions. And this is very concerning to us because as we go into the future, as technology takes up a bigger portion of our lives, we need to ensure that sustainability as a principle is embedded into computer science, into computer engineering education in our tertiary institutions. And that's something that is sort of starting to happen, but it needs to happen at a far quicker pace, right? And that's really how, when we educate the future workforce, and when these students eventually go into tech companies in the future, they will naturally code greener. So that's the first point. The second point is on non-coding digital practices. What do I mean? We're talking about things that relate to technology that do not involve computer coding. An example would be sustainable UI UX. So when you design a website, right, you use UI UX, user interface, user experience. That's what UI UX stands for. So when you have sustainable UI UX, what happens is that you are designing your computer interface, you're designing your website, your mobile application in a way that is environmentally friendly. A very simple example would be to use a more minimalistic approach to designing your web page so that users who come to your website or your mobile application can quickly find what they need. Because the longer they take, the more they scroll around aimlessly on your web page, the more excessive data is consumed. The more unnecessary data is consumed means that more unnecessary energy is consumed by your device to power the search, right? So this is the second example. And the last point would be computer code itself. And what we see is a lot of times, computer code nowadays is unnecessarily bloated. there is a lot of inbuilt redundancy to ensure that, well, the whole system doesn't fail. And while that's good in moderation, we sometimes see it being done excessively by third-party players who are building and selling platforms for a vast majority of our organizations today. So these are three fundamental aspects that can and need to be changed.
That is Yan Chu, founder of Greeny Web, a Singapore-based startup working to clean up the digital world. Fei Fei, looking ahead to 2026, what climate developments or potential turning points should people be watching most closely?
Well, I think for a lot of people, there are a lot of emerging technologies. And I think this year in particular, the development of hydrogen has been on the attentions of a lot of people. And I think here in China, even though internationally a lot of countries are sort of giving up on these technology pathways, but here in China, we are still pushing ahead, experimenting, building more projects, because a lot of experts here in China believe that hydrogen can play a role. It may not be a major role in our overall energy system, but it can play a role in, for example, power storage sectors, in help solving the problems of when we have a large input from the solar and wind power generators, but we are not able to immediately put them on the grid. And hydrogen can play a role here. And also hydrogen's been a key part in decarbonizing the heavy truck sector. So a lot of heavy transportations, their means can be looking at the use of hydrogen as well, instead of cutting when it comes to phasing out fossil fuels. And also in power storage and other sectors, I think a lot of very exciting developments are happening in the renewable and new energy sectors.
Yeah, there's a lot to expect. And thank you, Fei Fei. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you for having me today.
And that's all we have for this edition of Climate Watch. You can find more episodes on your favorite podcast platforms. Just search for Climate Watch and hit subscribe. Don't forget to leave us a quick review or share it with a friend. We'd also love to hear from you. You can email us at radio@cgtn.com with your questions or feedback. I'm Zhao Ying. Thank you so much for listening, and Happy New Year.